Hey there guys, this is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review. This is gonna be the final movie review to close off the October season, and I figured since I, recently reviewed the first Invisible Man movie, the Invisible Man from 1933, the black and white classic Universal monster movie, I figured since I reviewed the 1933 version, I might as well talk about the 2020 version directed by Lee Winnell. So, yeah. Anyways, the plot of this movie is as follows. Trapped in a violent, controlling relationship with a wealthy scientist, Cecilia, played by Elizabeth Moss, escapes in the dead of night and disappears into hiding. But when her abusive ex suddenly dies, Cecilia suspects his death was a hoax. As a series of eerie coincidences turn lethal, threatening the lives of those she loves, Cecilia's sanity begins to unravel while she desperately tries to prove she is being hunted by someone nobody can see. So that's basically the plot synopsis to the movie. And so anyways, well, how was this movie made? Well, now some of you guys might not know this, but originally, before he was a movie director, Lee Winnell was a he didn't now Lee Winnell before he was a director on movies, he started off as a writer. Now, he did not direct the movie. James Wan directed the first one, but Lee Winnell wrote the script to the very first Saw movie that was released in 2004. He also wrote the script to Saw 2, and he also wrote the scripts to Insidious 1 and Insidious 2. But then in 2015, Lee Winnell made his directorial debut with Insidious Chapter 3, which was a pretty good sequel. And then, well, and again, so how was The Invisible Man made? Well, for those who don't know, that 2017 version of The Mummy starring Tom Cruise, that movie that nobody liked, that was supposed to kick off a cinematic universe of movies called The Dark Universe, but it bombed and it got terrible reviews, so that idea was scrapped. But then in 2018, Lee Winnell directed a movie called Upgrade, an original action sci-fi movie, and it was a very well-received movie by both critics and audiences. So because of that, it was announced in 2019 that Lee Winnell was going to do his own take on The Invisible Man, set to release in 2020. And so the movie was shot and marketed, and when the movie was released on February 24th of 2020 in the US, it received positive reviews from critics and audiences and was a big hit at the box office, making $107 million worldwide on a $7 million budget. The movie was praised for its great performance by the lead. The movie was praised for its performance by the lead actress Elizabeth Moss, and it was also praised for the atmosphere and the tension and the overall story. Now, as for my reaction of the movie, I do prefer the 1933 movie version of The Invisible Man, but I did rather enjoy this version, the Invisible Man 2020. And now, there was a movie. Now, this is not connected to this movie or the 1933 Invisible Man movie, but in the year 2000, there was a movie called Hollow Man starring Kevin Bacon, but that movie was done by Sony. However, this movie, on the other hand, The Invisible Man from 2020, this movie was done by both Blumhouse Productions and of course, Universal Studios, the studio that did the original black and white Invisible Man movie from the 1930s. But yeah, so without further ado, let's get into my review. So the movie starts off where we are introduced to our main character, Cecilia, who is played by, of course, Elizabeth Moss, who prior to this, she was in the TV show The Handmaid's Tale, which I have not seen that show, but I have heard some really good things about it. But I thought she was great in this movie as the lead character. But like I said, we're introduced to her character at the beginning of the movie where she is basically sleeping in bed next by her abusive ex-boyfriend, Adrian Griffin, which one thing I will say I do like about this version. So for those who don't know, The Invisible Man is actually based on a book, and the book was written by H.G. Wells, and it was published all the way back in the year 1897. And in that book, the main character's name, the Invisible Man, was named Jack Griffin. Same with the original movie from the 1930s. But I like how they changed up the main character's name, but still kept the last name the same. I thought that was a nice little homage to the original movie, and the original story. But anyways, getting back to the review. So Cecilia is she's trying to be as quiet as she can and sneak out at night, and her ex-boyfriend Adrian basically is a millionaire that owns this mansion. Not really a mansion, but like a really nice house that, certainly nothing my parents or I would ever be able to afford, but it's basically close to the ocean, and there's like a wall with a gate, and Cecilia decides to sneak out of there, and she has a pet dog, and the dog is outside staring at her, about to leave, when Cecilia has a bag packed, and the dog accidentally bumps into the car, triggering off an alarm, which obviously wakes up the husband in bed. So Cecilia, played by Elizabeth Moss, she basically runs, and she gets over the wall, and she was able to call her sister to be able to pick her up, and Cecilia reaches her sister's car, and she says, don't ask, just drive. And the sister's like, Cecilia, are you okay? And then Adrian Griffin he says, open the door, and then in a very intense scene, smashes the glass window open, and, like the sister drives away. And then, the movie cuts to 2 weeks later, where Cecilia is staying at a friend's house by the name of James, who has a daughter named Sydney. And, throughout the course of the movie, they do get along with each other, but some weird coincidences start to happen, which makes Cecilia suspect that, maybe Adrian isn't dead, because, well, basically Cecilia is told by her sister that Adrian Griffin was dead, that he committed suicide and stuff like that. However, again, she is starting to suspect that his death might have been a hoax, and even, Ted, which is a lawyer, but also the brother to Adrian Griffin, he says to Cecilia, I have a pile of ashes in the box that would disagree with you, but Cecilia says that he has figured out a way to make himself invisible and stuff like that, and he's trying to stalk me, but of course nobody will believe her. But Cecilia's like, no, he faked his own death and stuff like that. But of course, no one thinks like that in this movie. But I mean, yeah. And one thing I will say I do really like about this movie, the original Invisible Man movie, it was more of like a science fiction movie, but it had like some dark comedic bits. I like how this movie pretty much removes all the comedy and makes more of a serious version. And I do like the new take on this story. I thought that if you were going to do a new version of The Invisible Man, that this was a very creative take on the story. And I would go as far to call this movie a modern day classic for a horror thriller film, This movie, what makes this movie work so well is that this movie is able to be scary and suspenseful, but even the moments that are predictable are still suspenseful, and that's because Leigh Whannell did a really good job directing this movie. And I would consider this a modern day horror classic. This movie has a lot of vibes from a classic John Carpenter movie, and like the original Halloween, or the 1982 movie The Thing starring Kurt Russell. Like, this movie has like suspenseful vibes from those movies, and that's not a bad thing. Like, that's a compliment. And Leigh Whannell did a banger job with this movie. But anyways, getting back to the review of the movie itself, Cecilia is about to talk to her sister, but her sister is upset with her, and because because Adrian Griffin, who found a way to perfectly make himself invisible and fake his death, he was able to send an email to Cecilia's sister, like a really disgusting email saying that you're a terrible person and like you deserve to have bad things happen to you. And Cecilia is trying to talk to her sister, but her sister's like, "Oh, I didn't know that's how you felt about me." And then Cecilia's like, "No, I didn't type that. He's doing this to me." And she's like, "Wait a minute, Adrian?" She's like, "Yeah, okay." He says, and then she says, "Cecilia, you need to take some meds. Like, Adrian's dead," and stuff like that. And then Cecilia even reads the email for herself, and like she reads it, and like, she gasps and has tears out of her eyes, like, she's absolutely disgusted by this. I would be disgusted too if I was in the same situation, to be perfectly honest. And another aspect I like about this movie, basically how Leigh Whannell, you know, obviously this isn't as good as the movie from the 1930s, but one thing I appreciate about this new version, the director Leigh Whannell, he got his, the movie that he got inspiration from to make this is very interesting. Leigh Whannell was a fan of classic John Carpenter horror movies growing up, but he was also a fan of the 1991 thriller movie Sleeping with the Enemy starring Julia Roberts, which I do rather like that movie, so he basically took the idea of Sleeping with the Enemy, but he basically thought, I'm going to do that, but with the Invisible Man, but I'm going to make a suspenseful movie with John Carpenter vibes, and I think he was able to blend that perfectly. But again, throughout the course of the movie, Adrian Griffin messes with Cecilia's life because he's invisible. And then of course there's the whole scene where Sydney, which is the girl who you see wearing the pinkish purple, basically the pink shirt, the purple shirt on the back cover, which is the daughter of the police officer James, which is the name of the person's house Cecilia is staying at. Basically Sydney says to, and keep in mind, Cecilia, like, she's like 10 feet away from Sydney, laying on the ground and stuff like that and crying. And then Sydney says to her, I think we need to have a girls' night out and get ice cream. And then Cecilia smiles and says, yeah, I would like that. And then there is a very intense scene where Sydney, she closes her eyes and looks down, but then the Invisible Man who's in the room violently slaps this teenager across the face, and Sydney freaks out thinking that Cecilia is the one who didn't when she didn't. So, like, Adrien Brody, not Adrien Brody, Adrian Griffin, aka the Invisible Man, he is really screwing with Cecilia's life. And again, that's a rather intense scene. And then, so the main police detective, James, is like, Cecilia says, no, it was him. And then he was like, oh, stop it, and stuff like that. And then he says, you shouldn't even be here right now. You're scaring my daughter. So then James is able to, so then James decides to leave Cecilia alone in the house. And again, this movie does have some really good suspenseful scenes in it, Granted, even though it is a predictable moment, the whole scene where Cecilia decides to call Adrian Griffin's phone, but she hears the phone ringing in the attic door above, and so she decides to go check it. Like, that's an intense scene. And she basically gets this phone, and she basically finds like a large bag with like a knife in it, as if it was like evidence that police would gather. And so Cecilia opens up the attic door, and there's a ladder that went up to it, and granted, even though it is a predictable scene, it still was a rather intense scene where she basically takes the white paint and she pours it, and it lands on top of the Invisible Man, which, freaks her out. And again, that's a rather intense scene. Even if it is predictable, it's still intense. Like, that's what Leigh Whannell is good at as a director. I mean, minus the exception of that new Wolfman movie, which sucked. Like, that's what Leigh Whannell is good at as a filmmaker. Like, even moments that are predictable, he can still make intense. And then the whole scene where, Cecilia is out, and the whole scene where Cecilia basically is holding a knife in the kitchen, and she was like, come out wherever you are and stuff like that. And she's about to strike, and she's standing in the kitchen holding a knife, but then the Invisible Man picks her up and like holding her in the air, choking her, making her drop the knife. And then the Invisible Man picks her up and slams her into the wall, busting some of the wall. And then Cecilia's trying to fight him off by smashing pots and pans at him. Again, that's a rather intense scene with how Leigh Whannell was able to craft that scene. And I'm going to admit, I did see this movie in theaters when it came out, and I'm going to say, the whole scene where the Invisible Man, picks up, even though I could see it coming, the part where he picks up Cecilia and, slams her into the wall, I did actually kind of jump at that bit. That actually was a bit effective. But then, Cecilia is able to, and again, one thing I do like about this movie is you don't see the Invisible Man, attacking people right away. Like, this is definitely a slow burn horror thriller film, but like, and I again, this movie does have good atmosphere to it. Like, for instance, there's a scene in the movie where Cecilia is standing outside when it's dark out at night, and then she breathes, and because it's cold out, we see steam coming out of her mouth. And then there's breathing behind her, and we see steam behind her, but there's no person there we can see. Like that's some rather good tension there. And then Cecilia is able to call someone, basically like a cab driver, to basically go back to the house where Adrian lived, because Adrian was rich. Because because Cecilia is trying to find proof that she's not insane. And so she gets what she needs, and she's able to escape it, and she basically tells the guy to drive because Adrian, as the Invisible Man, did attack her. And one thing I will say I do like about this version that was a bit different from the original, in the original movie as well as the original novel by H.G. Wells, the Invisible Man, the whole reason he was invisible in the first place is because he had a serum that turned him invisible. I like how they take a different approach in this version, where in the Invisible Man 2020, the Invisible Man basically built Adrian Griffin, basically because he was rich and he had technology. He basically built a suit which turned him invisible, which I thought, okay, that was actually a clever new change to the story. And then, of course, there's the whole scene about, about close to an hour into the movie where Cecilia, is at a restaurant talking to her sister, and she says, I have something that I went to Adrian's house. There's a suit that makes him invisible, and she said, I have this thing right here that can prove I'm not insane. And then, and Cecilia's sister asks, what is that? And then there's the whole scene where basically the Invisible Man is holding a knife, and then, is basically responsible for attacking Cecilia's sister, resulting to the demise of Cecilia's sister. And Cecilia is framed for a murder she didn't do, as the Invisible Man, after he attacks Cecilia's sister with the knife, places the knife in Cecilia's hand, and then someone at the dinner table looks at Cecilia, then screams out loud, and everyone panics. So then the police arrest her, and then Cecilia is basically brought to a mental institution, a psych ward, to basically get help and stuff like that. And then this leads to my favorite part of the movie, where Cecilia is in her bedroom, after a little bit, and she's basically cutting part of her arm with a pen, but the Invisible Man grabs it when she's in the shower, and then Cecilia's like, there you are. And then Cecilia, she's taking the pen and she's like stabbing the Invisible Man over and over, but like the Invisible Man, like, we're starting to see his tech suit, flicker, and she yells F you and stuff like that. And then the Invisible Man throws her across, and then a security guard comes in and says, go back to sleep now. And then the security guard starts to see some of the suit of the Invisible Man, and he starts to aim a gun at it, and then, but the the Invisible Man puts the guy's gun down and then tases the cop with that. Then Cecilia has to escape the room. And then, of course, this leads to the whole scene where the Invisible Man is massacring a bunch of police officers in a hallway. Again, I thought that was a rather intense scene. And then Cecilia is able to escape the place. She steals someone's car. And then Cecilia gives James a call saying that he says, James, you got to go back to the house. Your daughter might be in danger. And Cecilia was right, because the Invisible Man is at the house of is at James's house, and the Invisible Man attacks James's daughter. And I got Sydney, and I gotta say, the whole scene where the daughter is freaked out because the Invisible Man is like shaking her dresser, and like Cindy runs out into the hallway, and then the Invisible Man just slaps her on the neck, knocking her to the floor and is choking her. That's a rather intense scene. And then the police detective James shows up, and he's like, Cindy, are you okay? And then the Invisible Man attacks the dad. Again, that's a rather intense scene. And then the movie ends, and then, closer to the end of the movie, Cecilia arrives at the house, and she takes a gun, and, like, she starts shooting the Invisible Man, and then the suit is now visible, so they unmask the Invisible Man, and it turns out that it was apparently Adrian's brother wearing the suit. But then a bunch of police detectives go to Adrian's house and find Adrian tied up. And then near the end of the movie, James basically says that we found Adrian tied up, and that Adrian was a victim like you. But Cecilia says to him, no, that's just simply not true. And Cecilia said, if Adrian can fake his own death, he could also fake his own kidnapping. But then James is like, look, I'm just trying to do my job. Also, there were some people at the hospital that said they saw some weird stuff. So this is your closest chance for you getting your freedom back and stuff like that. But then near the end of the movie, Cecilia decides to go to Adrian's house, and Adrian, but Adrian wants to have a kid, and but Cecilia says, okay, if I'm going to have this kid with you, I want you to start it with honesty. And I want you to admit it was all you trying to stalk me as the Invisible Man. But she said, I want you to admit it was you as the Invisible Man, but you faked your own death, and you faked your own kidnapping, and you put your brother up to it. And then he said, no, that's not true. But then Cecilia, and this is clever, Cecilia, because obviously he's rich, he's able to have technology for security cameras. I like the whole part where Cecilia says, hey, could I go to the bathroom to change quick? And he's like, sure. And then Cecilia goes into the bathroom, and she puts on the Invisible Man suit, and, she basically makes Adrian attack himself, and then Cecilia is able to walk away with the Invisible Man suit, go back to the bathroom unchanged. But again, we don't see this on camera. And then she walks out, and then she basically screams, horrified, to see that Adrian has his throat slit. And while this is going on, James is in the car listening with headphones, built-in headphones and stuff like that. And he hears that Cecilia is calling the police saying a guy attacked himself. And then so James runs to the place, and then Cecilia hangs up the phone and is out of sight from the camera. And she says, because let's be honest, yes, Adrian was found tied up, but we as the audience, we all know for a fact that Adrian was the one stalking her. So for that reason, I don't blame Cecilia for doing what she did. And then the movie ends where Cecilia, where James is talking to her saying, you wanted him to admit it on camera, didn't you? And then she says yes. So then the movie ends where Cecilia, walks away carrying a bag with the dog, and then she stares into the camera with some good music playing, and then the movie ends. So yeah, at the end of the day, The Invisible Man from 2020 is a fantastic movie, and it's not as good as the 1933 version, but I thought that this was a really good up-to-date version. If I really only have one problem with the movie, now do not get me wrong, the practical effects are really good, and this movie does use a decent amount of practical effects, but there are some CGI bits I don't think are the best, like when it comes to the whole knife part, you know, I think that CG could have been done a little better. And another thing is, like, granted, I understand why they did it for plot convenience, but considering the fact that there's, like, you know, considering the fact that Cecilia was, like, in a fancy restaurant, like, don't you think the security guards would have cameras so they would be able to see that she's not the one who attacked her sister? But other than that, other than those two little nitpicks, The Invisible Man from 2020 is a really good movie. And on a scale of 1 to 10, I am going to give this movie a 9 out of 10. So yeah, there we go, guys. I finally wrapped up the October reviews, and tomorrow will be a video called 31 on 31. And tomorrow's video will be a 31 on 31 video ranking 31 zombie movies on October 31st. But we'll catch you guys later. Until then, bye-bye now.